you hear me? Okay, we're using this, but anyway. My name is David Schleper, and I'm part of the Shakopee Heritage Society. And once a month or so here, we do a presentation about the history of Shakopee. And today we're talking about Thomas Holmes and William Quinn, and they're arriving here at what they called Holmes Landing. Remember, I talked about before, if you were here before, we talked about there were actually 8 names for the name of Shakopee before it became Shakopee what it is now. And one of the names that used to be called for this area was called Holmes Landing. Sometimes I also found one place where it called it Holmesville. But I think one more common that I heard was Holmes Landing, so we're going to keep it at that, okay? So when we talk about Thomas Holmes, it's interesting because the research, or actually I think once it was even online for a while, I don't know if it's still, they talk about Thomas Holmes as the father of Shakopee. The problem with that, unfortunately, I think, is that there were already 600 people living here before he even got here. The Dakota Indians lived here starting in the 1600s, first on the north side of the river, and then in 1839 they went to the south side of the river. So they were here at the time when they came here. But just so you know, Thomas Holmes is an important part of the history of Shakopee. He was born in 1804 in Pennsylvania, and he was one of several kids. His parents, his father was a judge, court judge, and they moved around quite a bit. Thomas said he never learned how to read or write. So he's not a very good example for anyone either, if we think about it that way. But at some point, he moved further west, and then west again, and west again. He finally met, when he was in Marion, Ohio, he married Ursula Kennedy. That was in 1829. Now it's important because the Kennedy is an important part of the history of Shakopee also, because Thomas Holmes and Robert Kennedy and family moved to the Winona Prairie area of Minnesota. And they wanted to actually set up a trading post though at that point. But Wabasha said, no, you can't be here. So they went across the river into what is now Wisconsin at Eagles Bluff. And then they had a trading post there for quite a while. And they called it Holmes Landing. Apparently he liked to use that name over and over again. All right. Now, today it's called Fulton City. Okay. So we have to understand a little bit about the Kennedy family. Remember, Ursula Kennedy married Thomas Holmes. Robert Kennedy was born in Jefferson County, Virginia. Now it's West Virginia. Just so you know, when they got to Wisconsin, he married Frances Jones. They will eventually move to Shakopee. Okay. Now Ursula Kennedy Holmes, she was, well, both of the Kennedys were working with at a hotel, and you know, they ended up getting married. Thomas Holmes and Ursula got married. Ursula thought it would be a great life. Let's move west and have a great time. But she had a vision kind of the West as being kind of already set up. It wasn't. And it tended to be that she started to have panic attacks all the time. And it got really bad that she started using opiates. And in fact, she ends up dying in 1841 from opiate overdose. Okay. Now it's interesting because her brother, Robert Kennedy, said that she was a big baby. I mean, he really didn't like her. I think because she didn't like to go along with the program. She didn't like the change that was happening. They were moving west. And it's also interesting to note that Thomas Holmes actually had 4 wives. Okay, after Ursula died, she married Witcha. They only lived for about 1 year, and then she died. She was only about 14 or 15 years old. When Thomas Holmes moved here to Shakopee, well, it wasn't called Shakopee at the time, but when he moved here, he married Helen Tazy. She was 15 years old. Thomas was 50. My understanding of that marriage, you can read that, because they actually went to court at one point. And according to Thomas Holmes, the 2 of them never slept together in 3 years. So that's why they wanted to finish. Apparently, Helen went to all the stores in Shakopee and she bought a lot of stuff, clothes and stuff. But she didn't let any marriage bed part come in at all. So after 3 years, they got divorced. And then a few months later, Harry is in the picture, and they got married. She was also quite young, but they ended up staying or continuing to be there together for the rest. So again, Thomas actually had 4 wives. What's interesting, when you look at the research, they never talk much about any of those wives completely. You know, they kind of don't do that anyway so much because of the history of the time, but at the same time, it's also kind of interesting because you really had to research. I looked at about 10 different books in order to find the information. Question?
I'm assuming Witchy was a native woman?
Yes, she was in Winona area. Yes, she was. And he wanted, as was popular, because remember, they were traders and having a store, and so he felt that there's a little bit of a, what we call it tended to be that that's how they would try to get into to that tribe. If you married one of their children of the chief, then that will give you preference for trade from then on. And so that's why he did that. I'm not sure that she liked it. They said that within a year, she so missed her prairie and her life there that she didn't kill herself, but she just stopped eating and died.
Did he have any children then?
So it's just an interesting part of it. I think it's interesting because they talk about Thomas being the father of Shakopee, but when you really look at it, it's kind of embarrassing. You really don't really want to talk to him as the father of Shakopee. But anyway, Thomas Holmes and Robert Kennedy headed to Minnesota Territory. And Kennedy, first he went to St. Paul, and they had a Central Hotel, and he was working there. And then he moved to Shakopee in about 1854.
She had a question.
That's your question?
Do you have a question?
Oh, I wondered if they had any children.
Oh, they didn't have any children. However, in the research they talk about when Ursula, they kind of adopted, a Native American girl who were very close. Ursula and the child were very close. But when she died, there's no more mention about the child, so we don't know what happened with that. I've been looking and I'm continuing because there has to be some more information about that. But so far, like I said, I've checked different old histories of different places, Wisconsin and Illinois, Minnesota, but I can't find anything about that at this point. But they didn't, of the other four, I mean, of the four, they had no children. The one obviously couldn't have because she said she never did anything for 3 years, so. All right. So it's interesting though, anyway, in 1854, just so you know, then so Robert Kennedy moved to this north side of First Street, across from the sports stop, now where it was sports stop. The house later became the Huss House, and it was raised to make room for the downtown bypass, just so you know. And he operated a hotel, which was called the Florence Hotel, and it was across from the Argus building on First and Lewis Street. Okay. Obviously, it's not there now. But there was there's an ad in the paper that was talking about, hay, oats, and corn constantly and with good accommodations for teens. Okay. And eventually, in a few years, just so you know, Robert Kennedy then moved to St. Paul, and he's kind of out of the picture at that point. Okay, so I just want to know about the tie into the Kennedy, Ursula, and Robert Kennedy and their connection. Now, meanwhile, when you talk about Shakopee area, it was not open for white settlement. It was not allowed in 1851. They had to wait until February 1853 when there was a ratification of treaties. But Thomas Holmes wanted to be here because he figured he wants to find a place that could become a town so that he could make some money. Okay? And so he wanted to establish townships, and he ended up did about 5 different towns that were named after or from Thomas Holmes. They weren't all named Holmes Landing, which was here at one point and changed. But anyway, that's kind of what he wanted. He wanted the profits from them. So you had to go at that time and ask to have permission for a white person to be in the area. And he asked for open to the Minnesota River area. I would like to be able to be there, and I'd like to be able to have trade. And he was turned down. So he went back again, and this time he asked for just 2 places. And they said yes. And that's when it came then to Shakopee. You know, the 2 towns that then he ended up building, I guess, in this area would be Shakopee and Chaska. And this is just...
Who turned them down? Was it the native people?
What's that?
Is that who turned them down? The native people said...
No, there are, it actually would be like the governor, or not governor, but the people who were involved with the thing can decide who can or can't go in at that time. Basically, it was a way to get probably the right people in who could make money, which they would then get some of it. That's basically what happened. This is just an interesting picture because it's actually showing Shakopee at that time. This is actually a drawing of somebody who was there this is probably 1853. And they're playing, you notice that they're playing a game on the prairie. And Shakopee, remember, the reason it was so popular as a place to live in was because you had the river, and then it had about 4 miles, starting at the river, heading this way for 4 miles was just prairie. And so it was used for this game, which of course now is called lacrosse, okay? And that would be happening there. So it's just interesting that we actually have a drawing of something from that time showing this happening. So what happens is that Holmes was at Fort Snelling, and he met William Quinn. and they engaged them as a guide and a companion as they came looking for two places to have a trading post. Now, William Quinn, does everybody have, someone have a William Quinn thing to show, so you know? Yeah, so that's a picture from the newspaper at that, quite a bit later, but it's still the same thing. But he was born in Coldwater Springs near Fort Snelling. His father was an Irish immigrant, and his mother was part Cree Indian. So because of that, they really emphasized education for him. So he went, he was educated in Fort Snelling, and then he went to a boarding school in Fort Garry, which is in British North America or Canada, right? He ended up marrying Angelique Jeffries from the Metawakan Dakota community in 1848, and they had 3 children. But what's interesting about him and why Thomas got him involved is because he could speak Chippewa, Dakota, English, French, and probably other languages. So he was good at that, you know, and that was really important because when you're traveling, you don't know who you're going to contact, and to be able to have someone who could communicate, because Thomas couldn't at that point. He was able to, Thomas was able to do pretty good with some Dakota and English for the most part. Not great. And we looked, there's actually several years later, they actually asked Bill Quinn what he remembered. And he says, in a good canoe with a week's provisions, Holmes and Quinn traveled out from Fort Snelling. In a hollow near the Shakopee Indian village, remember the Indian village with 600 people who were living there, called Tiŋta-otoŋwe, okay? They landed and they looked over at the ground. So in other words, if you really look at where the main part of the Indian village here would be where, like Memorial Park, and then further south. Some people, I think Julius Collar, in a radio interview, he said it started at where Somerville Street is, and went that way, all the way to Shenandoah Road, okay, that area, and then straight back, that whole area. So that was where the Indian village was. So Thomas Holmes and Bill Quinn went a little bit over, which is now Holmes Street, right? And that's where they came in, okay? And then after that, they headed back, they went there, they went to Chaska, they decided on those 2 places as places that would be good trading posts. Bill Quinn said that he clearly, Thomas Holmes really wanted the Shakopee site because he felt that there was enough, because the Dakota were living right there, he would have a lot of trade going on, which is kind of what he wanted. Okay, and so he goes to Itasca. He brings the stock of goods back to Holmes Landing, which is what he called the area, for trade. Okay, and he went on this kind of boat that kind of looked like this, a flatboat. Okay, so they would put all the stuff on there, and then they used the thing to row as it went through. Okay. And they built the trading post. Now remember, there already was a trading post at the Faribault trading post, which was over a little bit further in part of the actual Tiŋta-otoŋwe area, was where we knew there was this, but it was a small trading post. He did one a little bit further over, okay? They said it was in 1851. It says on the river bank, on the levee, on the St. Peter's River, which of course later became Minnesota River. It would be on the east side of Holmes Street if you look at it now. So you look at where Holmes Street is, right? And you know that there used to be a bridge going across there. Okay, it's still there, right? Okay, it would be, in other words, not on First Avenue, it would be further, right to the river there. It's actually where they had the thing. And he said it, he actually did the line for chinking the logs, and was located on the riverbank between the present Holmes Street Bridge, and the front door was facing the river. Now, Moses Starr Titus, I think someone has a picture of him somewhere, probably. Yeah, okay. Moses Starr Titus was living here before then. He moved to Shakopee to be part of what was called an Indian farmer. And their job was to help teach the Dakota how to farm. Kind of strange because they already farmed for quite a long time, right? But remember, their view of farming was very different because the white people wanted the men to do the farming. In the Dakota belief, it was the women who did the farming. And so that's where that conflict was going on. Okay. Moses Starr Titus moved here to Shakopee, and he lived here. He ended up marrying Jane Lamont Titus. We've talked about him before, if you've been here before. She was part Dakota Indian. She lived with Samuel Pond, and she ended up speaking, well, she could speak Dakota. That's only all she spoke. She was 13 years old. She ended up speaking English also. They ended up getting married. But many years, in 1878, right before Moses Starr Titus died, he spoke at the Minnesota Historical Society, and he talked about what he remembered. And he said that after they secured the little craft to a bush, which he brought up to the bank of the river to examine the location, which was soon upon, almost by accident, he surveyed the country around, and he once concluded there was a chance. Being an old pioneer, he had some thoughts in advance of most other people, and they're determined to make his work. This was at the present day place of Shakopee. Remember that it was called Holmes Landing. They later changed it to Shakopee in order to get the chief to buy into what was going on. Okay. So again, Thomas, he said, pitched his tent and with few adventures set about building a house. The weather was hot, the mosquitoes was terrible, and thirsting for his blood. The old log cabin, which some of you have seen, and which I'd never have been removed, of course it had been, was erected. It's quite a respectable building to put up, and it was away from every person, place, and thing. A couple comments here. It really wasn't away from every person, place, and thing, because remember there were 600 people living there. They just weren't white people, okay? And it's also interesting because how he talks about this, he kind of discarded what Bill Quinn had to say. In fact, he's pretty much kind of out of the picture. So it's just interesting how different people's view and what they write in or out. Okay, Moses continued, he said, the winter set in, and how the cold days, weeks, and months before he could hope to see this town make a start. Holmes was aware that to make a town, there must be stores. So he opened a chicken trade with the Indians. He purchased their rat, which is muskrat, obviously, okay, and coonskins, ducks, quilts, and feathers. And he decorated the papooses with many strings of beads. And in the village, of course, was the second Chief Shakopee and the third Chief Shakopee, which was called Little Six. And again, Moses continued on. He said the foxes and wolves preyed upon his strychnine, I think I wrote, and he returned with their hides. The winter's long and cold, no news, no festivities, no pleasures, parties, no dancing, unless to warm toes, and no paper from St. Paul for Snell. So that's kind of what it was like the first couple winters here in what later became Shakopee. And this is actually a picture, but it does show, this was the house that they built first, and the trading post. And then the next year, they built this one, which is the home store. So there's actually two of them, okay? He was here first. When he moved here, Apgars moved into this house. And we'll talk about that, so just so you know. So again, this is right with the river there on the river, the Minnesota River, but on kind of Holmes Street area. And Henry Hines also talked about the research. He said, and he was a newspaper person, he said that there wasn't a lot of goods that were available. It was powder and lead, calico, some blankets, some tobacco, and some Indian trinkets. And that the Indians, remember there were 600 of them living there, they would come and they would bring in furs, and that's how they got their money in order to buy the other things that were there. And eventually the Dakota had to move out. They were forced out. And when that happened, they still would come back when they got their money, and they would still go to Thomas Holmes' store. It was very common. And so when you talk about in 1853, they were talking about when the Dakota Indians who lived here moved to a reservation. And they said there are hundreds of birchback and dugouts canoe wedged closely together, lining the south bank of the river from the present-day Lewis Street eastward for nearly a mile downstream to Ponds Creek. And if you know where Ponds Creek would be, that would be where the pond mill was located, which is at the end of Memorial Park, okay? And they said there was about 2,000 people that were on the river heading on October 19th. And the Shakopee story says that silently and sadly, the glum red men departed from the hunting grounds of their fathers to make a new home in an unknown country. So they're gone, and the white man moved in, okay? It's important just to remember that Thomas Holmes really was stricken with the town site fever. And it was very popular from about 1851 until about 1857 when it crashed, okay? So Thomas was very good at looking at an area and saying this would be a great area for a trading post or for a town, and they would actually build it. And so again, if you look at what the research shows, it says that the first building in the original site of Shakopee was the block house, which was built with the help of John Mackenzie, Emerson Shumway, and Daniel Apgar, who came with Holmes. So we'll go about first. The first one we got here is John Mackenzie. His actual real name actually is John Hamilton Mackenzie, spelled like this with a little A in there, okay, just so you know. He was born in Montreal, Canada. He came to Minnesota via Wisconsin and settled in Itasca, where he, of course, met Thomas Holmes. And he helped build the trading post here in town. And this is actually a picture, but it's not a very clear picture. I think someone has it on their thing somewhere, okay. It's not the best picture, but I did find one of him much later that has it, so I'll show you that in a few minutes. Okay. Now, another thing interesting about John Hamilton Mackenzie, he came here, he built that trading post, but then he also, just like Thomas Holmes, was looking for a place to build a town. And in 1852, he made a claim on section 34 and 35, in which now is part of Eden Prairie. And he called the place Hennepin. And they actually planted, or did a thing that shows they designed the whole thing already to have a village of Hennepin, Minnesota. If you look right now, there's not a Hennepin, Minnesota, right? But at that time, it was set up. And so they found out it was that a village of Hennepin was on the steep hillside slope on the north side of the Minnesota River, southeast of Flying Cloud Airport. So you kind of figure out where we're looking at now, so it's down, but against where the water is, okay? And it was a shipping point for grain, and there was a hotel there. There was a store, a gristmill, a sawmill, blacksmith shop, and a warehouse, and a few residents. But within 5 to 7 years, nothing was there. And you go there now, there's nothing. You couldn't see where it is. But there is, they have the actual schedule of how they designed the town and everything. So it was there as a concept. It just didn't work because Shakopee got bigger, and that became the place to go to instead of Hennepin, because the river just went better to come to Shakopee. Now, why is John Hamilton Mackenzie, why is he so important? Here's another reason. In 1864, he was in Fort Garry, okay, which is of course up in Canada, okay, near Winnipeg. And when he was there, Little Six and Medicine Bottle stopped at his log cabin. Of course, he knew them because he knew them here in what later became Shakopee. But at this point, after the war between the Dakota and the United States, Little Six and Medicine Ball went up to Canada where they were free. Okay. And so you've got them up in Canada, and you've got John Hamilton Mackenzie, and he was in secret cahoots with the U.S. Army, and they made an agreement that he would bring the two back to Minnesota so that they would be part of a trial. And so Mackenzie piled both of the Indian leaders with alcohol laced with drugs. They actually said that Little Six was about 53 years old, and he was doused with chloroform, and then became unconscious. Sorry, my stroke, something I can't get the words up, I can see it, okay. And then Medicine Bottle was in his 30s. He struggled a bit more, they got him, and they were both tied to dog sleds and taken to, eventually to Fort Snelling. By law, you can't actually steal someone from a different country and bring over to this country, but they still did it, so. And so you have them here in Fort Snelling. They actually had trial. It's also interesting because Mackenzie got $1,000 because he captured those two. That was a lot of money back then, okay? And the trial, there was a trial, they were both convicted. St. Paul Pioneer Press actually said it would have been more credible if there's actual evidence of their guilt had been obtained. They think they probably, possibly done it, but they're not sure, and they knew that they tend to brag a lot, so we're sure. But we do know that Little Six and Medicine Bottle were hanged on November 11th, 1865. And they said that Little Six's neck was snapped immediately, while Medicine Bottle took him about 10 minutes before he died. And there's actually a picture. It's not very clear, but it does show that actually they were there. So anyway, so it's interesting that Mackenzie, who was part of coming here to Shakopee to actually build the first trading post, ended up being one of the persons who actually caused the death of Little Six and Medicine Bottle. And then I wanted to show you another picture that's just kind of interesting. This actually shows, this was an artist, and this is actually in Shakopee. And they said it was probably in 1858 or so, this picture. And you can see there were some tents here, some of the cabins that they made. But then behind that, you can see, it's very hard to see in this picture, but there's actually houses and that Shakopee in the background. So it's just interesting, the connection back and forth. Okay, so again, another side, again, 1851, remember those people coming. We know that we have John Mackenzie. The next one is Emerson Shumway. He also was here. In fact, his name is Benjamin Emerson Shumway, and his wife, Mahala Compton Shumway, lived in Shakopee in 1851. Emerson built the trading post. Mahala was a servant, first for someone in Shakopee and then in Jordan. In 1852, Emerson got smallpox. He recovered, moved to St. Paul, and the two of them got married. Some of the research says they married in Shakopee, but there's no, the evidence actually was that it was in St. Paul. And there's actually a picture. So this is Benjamin Shumway. When we talk about Shumway Street in Shakopee, that's the person. This is, of course, much years later when we took this picture. And that is Mahala Compton Shumway. And there's a lot of stories about her. I think if you, the one book that we have about women in Shakopee, she has really interesting stories. She's an interesting person. And they say that in the news book, like the Shakopee story, they say that they headed west and were killed, but that wasn't true. And we actually find out the research, they actually, in 1859, they crossed the plains. They were in prospecting and mining in California and Nevada for 10 years. They had a stock ranch, and they both died in 1909 in Oregon. Okay. And there was actually the same person. So it's just interesting. Again, that's another one who came here to Shakopee. He was not here all that long. When you think about it, he was only here a couple of years. But because he was part, when they were building the town and naming the names of the town streets, he became Shumway in that. And also, in one of the things, the Shakopee story, we also mentioned Daniel Abgar. We kind of mentioned them a little bit before. But just so you know, he arrived in the fall of 1851 at Holmes Landing. He helped with the building the trading post. But then he also took a claim, and then he headed back east, got married to Minerva. I love that name, but I don't know if that's right, but I like the name. They got married, and they returned in the spring of 1852. And in October of 1852, they also brought his brother and his wife, his parents, and 4 younger siblings also arrived. And at that time, they said that Afkar families composed half the white population in 1853. Okay. So it's just interesting of different people, what's going on with all of them. Another person who was here, who was born here, was Eliza Faribault. She was the daughter of Oliver Faribault and Wankayanka. She was called Woman Who Sits at the High Place. And they actually built the first, really, house in Shakopee, if you really think about it, was a trading post for the Faribault trading post, which is now in the landing in Shakopee. In fact, when they moved here in 1854, Wankayanka was pregnant, and in 1855 they had Eliza. We have a picture of Eliza. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of Oliver or Wankayanka. And when we do a lot of interesting discussions with family members of the Faribaults, we know that Eliza remembers that they had a trading post in a warehouse, and that's true. And she remembered that her father had died. He died in the fall of 1850. She was only 4.5 years old when he died. He had quinsy, which was like kind of a sore throat, actually, I think, and he died. But they still lived in that house for years. The next generation, the next generation, and the next generation all lived at that log cabin. Okay. There's some others that were living here. In fact, were living here before Thomas Holmes was here. Was Hazen Moore and his wife. And then eventually, when they left, John Moore and Rosalie moved in. And just so you know, they built the house in 1846, and it was located, if you arrive in Shakopee, it would be where the duck pond is, right to the east of the duck pond. Okay, and it was not very far from where the cabin of Samuel Pond and Cordelia Eggleston Pond. And then another person that pops up right about the same time is the Somervilles. It was John and Sophrina. Now it's interesting to remember that Sophrina, her last name before she got married was Perry, which was the same person who was, just a minute, they're all related. Oh, I have to look back to find. Anyway, Sophia and her sister were both down here at the same time also. John Somerville was in the lumber business, came to Shakopee in the spring of 1851. He was involved as a commissioner in Scott County for a while. And the thing that Thomas Holmes did, starting, 3 times Thomas Holmes went west because he wanted to continue to find new towns and he wanted to find gold. Okay, so he led groups of people from here to west to Montana for the most part. Okay, and John and Sophrina actually went with one time. And they landed in a place that was called Last Chance, which is now in Montana, okay? And the people there, they had a meeting, this was in 1864, and they tried to decide what name should be the town instead of Last Chance. And people offered names. This is true. Someone said Squash Town, and Pumpkinville, and Winona, and Rochester, and Toma, you know. And Somerville stood up, and they said he was about 6 feet 4 inches tall. So he was taller than most of the other people in the room. And he stood up and he said, we need to name the town Helena, because there's a place in Scott County where I lived, and it was in the best county in the best state in the Union. Okay? That's what he said. This is actually a picture of the general store in Helena. But they ended with, now it's important, they actually voted, and Helena won. Okay? But it's interesting because the place is still there in Montana. But it's not called Helena, it's called Helena. Okay? And that's because a hack driver misspelled the name. And people followed that after that. So it's just interesting that the name in Montana is actually named after Somerville. And they came back to Minnesota. So Frina died, and she's buried at the Valley Cemetery. John Somerville had a wart in the back of his right hand. He tried all different ways to stop it, you know, but he didn't succeed. And eventually it turned to cancer and extended up his arm and into his body. And he ended up dying penniless, I should say, in St. Paul. He was 79 years old. So he had made a lot of money when he went to the gold rush, but he ended up with nothing. And then the other ones that I think are interesting to remember, one is there were two African Americans who lived in Shakopee, James Thompson and James Griffin. And it's important to remember that because James Thompson is very well known in Minnesota as a person who was here, who built what became later St. Paul. He was very much involved with that. He was born in the plantation house of President Monroe. They don't think it was Monroe's child, but they think it's Monroe's brother's child, probably. Okay? In other words, he was probably half African American and half white. And he ended up being a slave to Monroe's nephew, who then sold him for gambling debt. And they ended up in Fort Snelling. Now, when he was here, and he was smart, he married actually the daughter of plowman here in St. Paul area. And a missionary decided they wanted to take him and use him as an interpreter because he could speak Dakota, because his wife was Dakota, and obviously they did talk to each other, I'm guessing. Okay. So how does it come to Shakopee is this. In a book here in Shakopee, they talk about the word, I'm changing a little bit, it's Nigger Jim built where Michael Barron's store is. And Mackenzie built a blacksmith shop back of Strunk and Sons drugstore. So we knew that there was an African American here in Shakopee at that point. So then we look at Michael Barron's store and we find out that it was a fruit and confectionery store. Remember, Barron's had two stores downtown. One was on Holmes Street. On the left side was one, on the right side was another, two different siblings, and then the other one was further on the north side of the First Avenue. It was on the north side for 25 years. And before then, that was where James Thompson built a store. Now, it's just interesting, we won't go more into this except that it's interesting. We know that it was him because they lived in Eagle Creek Township, which is now part of Shakopee. Okay, and we know them because it has the Thompson, the Barnes, which is the daughter's husband, and St. Clair, which was a kid that they adopted. It's interesting, they were living here in Shakopee in 1857 and also in 1860 in the census. It's also interesting because it's all listed as that they were all white. Okay? And again, here's where the store would be. If you look at this, is the old Opera House. This is on First Avenue, right? The right music block. And right to here is where the confectionery store was. So it'd be about halfway down the block. Okay. And again, it's important to understand because you look at the history and it says there's no black person in Shakopee, that actually in 1857, 1860, they say he was white, but he wasn't. And his wife was Dakota, and the children would be 1/4 African American, 1/4 white, and 1/2 Dakota. Okay? So that's interesting because that arrived, and remember, that's not the first African American Shakopee. Before then, there was a slave who lived in Shakopee at the Faribault Trading Post and escaped from Shakopee. And so then we have this one, and then we had another one. James Griffin arrived in Shakopee in 1854. And again, how do we find out? We find in a diary here in Shakopee, he says, a black man by the name of Griffin commenced working for me on the 9th. This is 1854. We look at the research, we find out that James Griffin was born a slave in Prince George's County, Maryland. He was, his master didn't want to serve in the Navy, so he told him that he had to do instead. He was there for 5 years. He learned the carpentry trade. They freed him, and they came to Minnesota, and they're here in Shakopee, and they lived here for about 2 years. Okay? His wife was also African American, and they had 3 children at that time. They ended up moving to Buffalo, Minnesota, and he was a stagecoach driver. Now, just a couple last ones. Daniel Storr, who of course was talking about that book there, but he's important because he was in Shakopee starting in 1853 until about 1905, I think when he died. And he kept a diary. And the diary says what happened all the way through. It was great because, you know, in the newspaper, like the Valley Herald here in 1856, talk about that he's, you know, having jobs that he does, whatever. He was a carpenter. He helped build a lot of the early houses in Shakopee. And he was also played violin for dances, parties, and socials. And so that's why when he does that, he writes down the names of the people that he goes to, things that they do. So that's why you find some good history within there. He was born in 1828, moved to Shakopee in 1853. He married Ometi. How do you say that? Anybody know?
That sounds right, Ometi.
Okay, they got married. He kept a diary. He ended up dying in Shakopee, and he's buried at Valley Cemetery, so you can actually see it there. Okay. You can actually see it. If you go down to Valley Cemetery, find it. All right. Finally, I have one last person to just bring up here, and that's Timothy Canty. He's one that some people said he arrived with Thomas Holmes. He says he arrived a little bit after that, but he was involved. He was born in Canada. He was involved in the Mexican-American War. He married Margaret O'Keefe in St. Paul, and he helped build Holmes Landing. And because he was in the Mexican-American War, he was given land. And so he got 80 acres of land here in Shakopee. It's actually not right in Shakopee, but a little further out. Now it's probably part of Shakopee. And then at one point, he wanted to join the Civil War also, but he couldn't, because at that time, his wife was blind and couldn't see, so he felt he needed to be there. Now, why is he important? It's because one day, he said at the store one time, he told people that he knew General William Tecumseh Sherman. He said he was a fine officer and a real man. This is at the store in downtown Shakopee on Lewis Street. Most of the people didn't believe him. I mean, come on, he knew the person, you know, kind of thing, right? So what happened is at some point there's news traveling down the river that said that he was going to make a tour of the West, and he was going to stop in Shakopee. So of course the people are like, well, where's Canty? You know, yeah, bring him here because he knows him in person and stuff like that, right? And Tim didn't say really much, okay? But on the day of the visit, a cloud of dust was sitting down the trail. Here they come. There were a lot of people in downtown Shakopee because it was kind of a big thing. And the stage came in view with 4 large horses. They went by Strunk's drugstore, you know, on the north side of First Avenue, and stopped. And people cheered, and he put his hand out, though Sherman did, and waved or whatever. And then he kind of looked around the crowd, and he saw in the back was Timothy Canty. He had arrived to can't think of the word anymore to say it in English, but to sharpen the little knife. And he said, "Hello, Tim. Don't you remember you? You remember me?" And Tim came forward and shook hands, and they said their hands were clasped, and the embarrassed settlers who had doubted Tom's claim saw tears welling in the eyes of the 2 veterans, the general of all the armies and the humble homesteader.
So they knew each other in the Mexican War?
And they sure did, yeah. And there's actually more information about that. It's really interesting, but it just makes it kind of interesting at the time. And so it's just a good story. So again, here's what then at this point, this is where Shakopee was looking at that point. And I want you to see, because this hardware and stove thing, which is a restore, right, is where then eventually became the Opera House. Of course, torn down, then the Opera House was built. And then that was torn down in order to do the curve into the highway. It was torn down. But just kind of interesting that that was there at that time. And that's a little bit about William Quinn, Thomas Holmes, and the people that were here at Holmes Landing. And finally, on your paper that you have, this paper, if you have the back, if you have the letter A in a some color, the number A, got it? And you get this book, Collection of Early Shakopee, which includes the one about Tim Canty. So thank you again. I hope everybody has a good day. And the next thing coming up, just so you know, is the So Jazzy Shakopee in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Will be at the library on October 20th. And then on November 13th, it will be about sports in early Shakopee here. So again, the list is here so you know, so just keep an eye on that and continue to support the Shakopee Heritage Society. All right, have a good day, everybody.